The wrench slipped from Jake's greasy fingers and clattered onto the metal floor of his repair shop. He cursed under his breath and bent down to pick it up, wiping his hands on a rag that was probably dirtier than his hands. This was the third time this week that Frontier Station Epsilon had shaken like it was about to fall apart. The stabilizers were going bad again, but nobody seemed to care enough to actually fix them properly. Jake had been living on this dumpy space station for almost 4 years now. It wasn't much to look at. The walls were covered in rust, the air recyclers made weird clicking sounds every few hours, and half the lights flickered constantly. But it was home. Or at least it was the closest thing to home he'd had since leaving Earth. His repair bay was squeezed into a corner of the station's outer ring. It wasn't big enough to swing a cat in, let alone work on the bigger ships that sometimes docked here. But Jake made it work. He'd fixed everything from busted life support systems to alien weapons that nobody else would touch. If it was broken, Jake could probably fix it. That reputation kept food on his table, even if the food was usually just protein paste and reconstituted vegetables. He was in the middle of rewiring a plasma regulator when he noticed something weird. The usual noise from outside his shop had stopped. Frontier Station Epsilon was always loud. There were traders arguing in languages Jake didn't understand, cargo haulers beeping their horns, and the constant hum of hundreds of different species going about their business. But right now there was nothing. Just silence. Jake put down his tools and walked toward the bay door. He peeked out into the corridor and felt his stomach drop. It was empty. Completely empty. Even old Pete, the cranky alien who ran the junk shop across the way, had closed up and disappeared. Pete never closed early. Never. Something was very wrong. That's when Jake saw it moving at the far end of the hallway. At first he thought maybe it was just shadows playing tricks on his eyes. But then it moved again and Jake realized with horror that it was real. Something massive was prowling toward him, staying low to the ground, moving with the kind of smooth grace that only predators had. Jake's heart started pounding in his chest. He'd heard stories about these things. War beasts from the Cathari Empire. Giant killing machines that were part animal, part machine, and 100% deadly. They were supposed to be unstoppable. Once they locked onto a target, that target was as good as dead. And this one was coming straight toward him. Jake's mind raced back to 2 weeks ago. He'd fixed a Cathari military ship. The captain had been paranoid as hell, watching Jake's every move, asking weird questions. But the pay had been good, so Jake didn't complain. He'd needed to dig deep into the ship's computer systems to fix the navigation problem. While he was in there, he'd seen some military codes, some coordinates, stuff that was way above his pay grade. At the time, Jake had just ignored it. He wasn't interested in military secrets. He just wanted to fix the ship and get paid. But apparently someone thought he'd seen too much. The creature was only about 20 meters away now. Jake could see it clearly. It was huge, easily 200 kilograms of pure muscle covered in sleek black fur. Cybernetic implants ran along its spine, glowing faintly in the dim station lights. Its claws left deep scratches in the metal floor as it walked. And its eyes, those amber-colored eyes, were locked directly on Jake. Every instinct in Jake's body screamed at him to run. To seal the bay door and hide. To find a weapon and try to fight. But Jake had grown up different from most people. Before the corporations had destroyed his family's land, Jake's parents had run a wildlife sanctuary back in Wyoming. They'd worked with mountain lions, wolves, and other predators. Jake had learned from a young age that running from a predator was the worst thing you could do. Running triggered their chase instinct. And if this thing started chasing him, Jake wouldn't make it 10 steps. Fighting was just as stupid. This creature could tear him apart in seconds. So Jake did something that probably seemed insane to anyone watching. He walked back into his repair bay, sat down on the floor and crossed his legs. Then he looked directly at the war beast and waited. The creature stopped in the doorway. Its head tilted slightly to one side like it was confused. Jake could practically see the gears turning in its head. The beast had been sent here to kill him. But its prey wasn't running or fighting. The prey was just sitting there, calm as could be. Jake kept his voice low and steady. He'd learned this from his dad years ago. Predators responded to tone more than words. If you sounded scared, they knew it. If you sounded aggressive, they'd match that aggression. But if you sounded calm and confident, sometimes, just sometimes, they'd calm down too. He started talking to the creature, keeping his hands visible, his body language non-threatening. He told it that he knew someone had sent it to kill him. He told it that he understood it was just following orders. But he also told it that he wasn't going to make this easy. The war beast took a step forward. Then another. It was close enough now that Jake could smell it, a weird mix of ozone and something wild that reminded him of the big cats back home. He could see the creature's muscles twitching under its skin, see the way it favored its left side slightly. That's when Jake noticed something important. This animal was in pain. He'd seen that same body language in the sanctuary animals when they were injured. The tight shoulders, the careful way it moved, the tension in its jaw. Something was hurting this creature, and it had been hurting for a while. Jake spoke softly, telling the beast that he could see its pain. That whatever they'd done to it wasn't right. That he wanted to help. For a moment, nothing happened. The war beast just stared at him with those intelligent amber eyes. Then without warning it lunged. Jake threw himself sideways, rolling under the creature's massive body as it sailed over him. He came up running but not toward the exit. Instead he ran toward his workbench and grabbed his plasma torch. The beast landed, spun around with impossible speed and coiled its muscles to jump again. But Jake didn't point the torch at the animal. Instead he aimed it at the control panel next to the bay door and fired. The panel exploded in a shower of sparks and melted metal. The heavy blast door slammed shut with a boom that echoed through the bay. They were locked in together now. Trap. Jake dropped the torch and raised his hands. He looked at the war beast and said something that probably sounded crazy. He told it that now they had time to talk. That neither of them was going anywhere until they figured this out. The creature circled him slowly, growling low in its chest. But it didn't attack. It just watched, waited, studied him with an intensity that made Jake's skin crawl. This wasn't just some mindless killing machine. There was real intelligence behind those eyes. Intelligence and, if Jake wasn't mistaken, curiosity. Jake took a slow breath and introduced himself. He asked the creature what its handlers called it. Obviously it couldn't answer, but Jake felt like the question was important anyway. This thing deserved to be treated like an individual, not just a weapon. 3 hours passed. Jake was still alive. The war beast hadn't tried to kill him again. Instead, it had settled into a corner of the bay, watching Jake with unblinking attention. Jake pretended to work on some equipment, but his mind was racing. He'd managed to grab his scanner during the standoff, and now he carefully pointed it at the creature. What he saw on the readout made his blood run cold. The beast's vital signs were all wrong. His heart rate was way too high. Stress hormones were flooding its system. And there, buried in the data, Jake saw the reason why. The cybernetic implants weren't just control devices. They were sending constant pain signals through the creature's entire nervous system. Whoever had created this war beast had designed it to be in constant agony. Every second of every day this animal was being tortured by its own implants. And yet it was still following orders, still trying to complete its mission, still functioning despite the overwhelming pain. Jake looked at the creature with new eyes. This wasn't a monster. This was a victim. He spoke to the war beast again, telling it what he'd discovered. Telling it that the people who'd made it were torturing it on purpose. Asking it if it wanted help. The creature stood up and Jake's heart jumped into his throat. But instead of attacking, the war beast walked slowly toward him. It stopped just a meter away, towering over Jake's seated form. Then, moving with surprising gentleness, it lowered its massive head. Jake understood. It was giving him permission. Permission to try to help. Permission to touch it. Maybe even permission to trust him. With shaking hands, Jake reached out and placed his palm on the creature's head. The fur was softer than he expected, warm and alive under his fingers. The beast's muscles were tense, ready to snap Jake's neck if this turned out to be a trick. But it didn't pull away. Jake made a decision that would change his life forever. He told the war beast that he was going to remove the pain implants. That it would hurt during the procedure, but afterward, the constant agony would stop. He couldn't promise success, but he could promise he'd try his best. The creature's amber eyes met his, and Jake could have sworn he saw understanding there. Maybe even hope. Jake gathered every medical supply he could find in his cramped repair bay. He had some basic first aid stuff, a veterinary kit he bought years ago for emergencies, and a bunch of tools that were meant for machines but might work on cybernetic implants. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The war beast lay on its side, watching his every movement with those intense amber eyes. Jake could see the creature's chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. It was scared, but it was trusting him anyway. The implant was buried deep in the beast's left shoulder, right where the cybernetic components met flesh and bone. Jake's hands were shaking as he activated his precision laser cutter. One wrong move and he could sever an artery or damage the creature's nervous system permanently. The war beast would die, and Jake would probably be ripped apart seconds later by its dying reflexes. He talked while he worked, keeping his voice calm and steady. He told the beast about growing up in Wyoming, about the sanctuary his parents ran, about the mountain lion named Dakota who'd been his best friend when he was 12. Talking helped Jake focus, helped keep his hands from shaking too much. And maybe, just maybe, the sound of his voice was comforting to the creature too. The first incision made the war beast flinch, its muscles going rigid. But it didn't pull away. It didn't attack. It just lay there, enduring the pain because it trusted Jake to make things better. That trust made Jake's chest tight. This animal had been tortured for who knew how long, and yet it was still capable of trusting a stranger. That kind of courage deserved respect. Hours passed. Jake's back ached from hunching over. His eyes burned from staring at the tiny components. Sweat dripped down his face, but he didn't dare wipe it away. The implant was more complex than he'd expected. The pain receptors weren't just connected to the control system. They were the control system. Whoever designed this had made it so the beast would hurt if it obeyed commands and hurt worse if it didn't. It was psychological torture built into hardware. Jake cursed under his breath as he carefully separated the implant from the surrounding tissue. The people who did this were monsters. Pure and simple. They'd taken a living being and turned it into a weapon that suffered every moment of its existence. And for what? Military efficiency? Control? It made Jake sick to his stomach. The implant finally came free with a wet popping sound. Jake immediately grabbed his medical welder and started sealing the wound. The warbeast's breathing had become labored, its body trembling from the trauma. But the readings on Jake's scanner were already improving. The constant pain signals were gone. For the first time in probably years, this creature wasn't being tortured by its own body. When Jake finally stepped back, he was covered in blood that wasn't his own. His hands were cramping, his vision was blurry from exhaustion, and he was pretty sure he'd never been this tired in his entire life. But he'd done it. The implant was out, the wound was sealed, and the warbeast was sleeping peacefully for the first time since Jake had met it. He slumped against the wall, intending to rest for just a minute. His eyes closed and he was out like a light. Jake woke to the sound of alarms screaming through the station. He jerked upright, his heart hammering. How long had he been asleep? His body ached like he'd been hit by a truck. The warbeast was already awake, standing between Jake and the bay door, its posture completely different from before. It wasn't aggressive or hunting. It was protective. Someone was trying to break through the door. The metal groaned and buckled as something powerful slammed into it from the outside. Jake scrambled to his feet, looking around for anything that could be used as a weapon. Not that any weapon would help against whoever was out there. If they had the power to breach a blast door, they could definitely handle one exhausted human. The door exploded inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. 4 massive aliens in combat armor poured through the opening, weapons raised and ready. Behind them came another figure, this one clearly in charge. She was tall, covered in the same kind of fur as the warbeast, with armor that looked both ceremonial and functional. Her eyes locked onto Jake with an intensity that made him want to disappear into the floor. The lead soldier barked something in a language Jake didn't understand, but the tone was clear enough. You should be dead, human. Jake raised his hand slowly, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. He agreed that yeah, he probably should be dead. He'd gotten that reaction a lot lately. The female commander's gaze shifted to the warbeast, and her expression changed from cold fury to complete shock. The creature hadn't attacked the intruders. Instead, it had positioned itself between them and Jake like it was defending him. That apparently wasn't normal behavior for a warbeast. The commander snapped an order. The warbeast didn't move. She repeated the order, louder this time with more force. The creature growled in response, low and threatening. It wasn't obeying anymore. Jake found himself speaking before his brain could tell him to shut up. He explained that the beast wasn't her slave anymore. That he'd removed the pain implant. That the creature was free now to make its own choices. And apparently, it had chosen to protect Jake instead of killing him. The room went dead silent. Then the commander did something Jake didn't expect. She laughed. Not a happy laugh, but a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the metal walls. She asked Jake if he had any idea what he'd done. Did he understand that he'd just freed a military weapon? That he'd broken the Empire's property and stolen their asset? Jake's mouth was dry, but he managed to answer. He said he'd saved a life. Same thing he did every day in his repair shop. He fixed things that were broken. And this warbeast had definitely been broken. One of the soldiers raised her weapon, clearly ready to end this conversation permanently. But the commander held up a hand, stopping her. She stepped closer to Jake, studying him like he was some kind of bizarre puzzle she couldn't figure out. She asked why he freed the beast. Why he risked his own life for an animal that had been sent to kill him. Jake looked at the warbeast, who was still standing guard over him. He thought about all the suffering the creature had endured. All the pain it had pushed through just to survive another day. And he realized the answer was simple. Because it deserved better. Because no living thing should be tortured like that. Because someone needed to stand up and say that what was being done to these creatures was wrong. The commander studied Jake for a long moment. Then she told her soldiers to lower their weapons. She introduced herself as Matriarch Helen, leader of this military division. And she told Jake that he'd done something no one had accomplished in 1,000 years. He'd broken a war beast's conditioning through compassion instead of force. She said that made him either the smartest being in the galaxy or the dumbest. Her council would decide which. Jake felt his stomach drop. That sounded like he was about to be put on trial. Probably a trial that would end with his execution. He tried to point out that maybe this was all a big misunderstanding and they could just forget the whole thing happened. Helen smiled, showing way too many sharp teeth. She said Jake wanted to talk so they would talk. But that conversation would happen on her ship, in front of her superiors, where proper judgment could be passed. She ordered her guards to restrain him. The warbeast's growl deepened, rumbling through the entire bay like distant thunder. It took a step forward, placing itself even more firmly between Jake and the advancing soldiers. The message was clear. You're not taking him without going through me first. Jake put his hand on the creature's shoulder, feeling the powerful muscles tense under his palm. He told the beast it was okay. That fighting would only make things worse. That they'd figure this out together just like they'd figured out the implant removal. The warbeast turned its head to look at Jake, and for the second time, Jake saw real understanding in those amber eyes. The creature was asking if he was sure. If he really wanted to surrender to these people who might kill him. Jake nodded. The beast hesitated for another moment, then slowly stepped aside. It allowed the soldiers to put restraints on Jake's wrists, but it never stopped watching them. Never stopped being ready to intervene if they heard it's human. As the soldiers led Jake out of the repair bay, Helen walked beside him. She asked his name, her tone almost conversational despite the circumstances. Jake told her. She repeated it like she was testing how it felt to say. Then she told him that he'd accomplished something remarkable. Something that challenged everything her people believed about warbeasts and control and military efficiency. Whether that made him a hero or a criminal would be determined soon enough. Jake glanced back at the warbeast, which was following close behind despite not being ordered to. The creature had chosen to stay with him. Not because of programming or pain compliance but because it wanted to. Because somehow, in the span of a few hours, they'd formed a bond that transcended species and circumstance. As they boarded Helen's ship and left the station behind, Jake couldn't help but think about how his life had changed. 24 hours ago, he'd been a simple mechanic fixing broken equipment on a rundown space station. Now he was a prisoner being taken to an alien homeworld to face trial for freeing a warbeast. But he'd also made a friend. A real friend who'd chosen him not because it had to, but because it wanted to. And somehow that made everything else worth it. Whatever happened next, at least Jake wouldn't face it alone. The warbeast would be there, standing beside him, just like Jake had stood beside it when no one else would. The military ship was massive, easily 100 times bigger than anything Jake had ever worked on. The corridors stretched on forever, lined with weapons and armor that looked like they could level a small city. Everywhere Jake looked, he saw warriors training, planning, preparing for battle. These people were built for war, and it showed in every aspect of their culture. They'd given Jake a cell, but it wasn't like the prison cells back on Earth. It was more like a small apartment, clean and functional with a bed that was way too big for him and a viewport that showed the stars streaking by as they traveled through space. The warbeast had refused to leave his side, and surprisingly, Helen had allowed it. The creature lay on the floor next to Jake's bed, close enough that he could reach down and touch it if he wanted to. Jake had started calling the beast Shadow. It seemed to fit. The creature moved like a shadow, silent and smooth, and those dark fur and amber eyes reminded Jake of Twilight back home. Shadow seemed to accept the name, responding when Jake said it with a rumble that might have been approval. During the 3-day journey to the Kthari homeworld, Jake learned that Helen wasn't quite the cold military commander she'd first appeared to be. She visited his cell every day, asking questions about Earth, about his life, about why he saw things so differently from her people. She seemed genuinely curious about how a human could look at a weapon and see a friend instead. Jake tried to explain it to her. He told her about the sanctuary, about learning that predators weren't evil, they were just animals trying to survive. He explained that his parents had taught him to see past the teeth and claws to the individual underneath. Every creature, no matter how dangerous, deserved to be treated with respect and dignity. Helen listened carefully, her tail flicking back and forth in what Jake had learned was a sign of deep thought. She told him that the Kthari had used warbeasts for generations. They'd always believed the pain implants were necessary for control, that without constant discipline, the creatures would turn on their handlers. No one had ever questioned whether there might be another way. On the second day, Helen brought Jake to see the other war beasts on the ship. There were 18 of them, kept in reinforced cells that looked more like cages than living quarters. They paced restlessly, snarling at anyone who came close, their eyes wild with barely controlled aggression. Jake's heart broke looking at them. Every single one was suffering the same torture that Shadow had endured. He asked Helen if he could examine them, maybe help them like he'd helped Shadow. She was hesitant at first, pointing out that these beasts were still following their programming, still dangerous. But Jake persisted. He showed her the scans from Shadow, explained how the pain implants were slowly driving the creatures insane, argued that they were losing war beasts to malfunction because of the torture, not in spite of it. Finally, Helen made a decision that shocked her entire crew. She gave Jake permission to work on the war beasts under heavy guard. If he could prove that removing the implants made them more stable, not less, she would consider changing the entire program. Jake started with a female beast that the crew called Storm. She was massive, even bigger than Shadow, with fur that looked almost blue-black in certain lights. The procedure took 8 hours. Shadow stayed close the entire time, somehow communicating with Storm in ways Jake couldn't understand. The two beasts rumbled at each other, and gradually Storm began to calm down. When Storm woke up after the surgery, free from pain for the first time in 5 years, she did something that made every guard in the room take a step back. She approached Jake and pressed her massive head against his chest, a gesture of trust and gratitude that brought tears to his eyes. Over the next 2 days, Jake worked almost non-stop. Helen had assigned one of her officers, a scarred warrior named Kate, to assist him. Kate was skeptical at first, convinced that Jake was somehow tricking them, that the war beasts would turn violent the moment they got the chance. But as she watched beast after beast wake up calm and controlled after surgery, her skepticism began to fade. By the time they reached the Kthari homeworld, Jake had freed 15 war beasts from their implants. The creatures followed him around the ship like a pack, protective and loyal not because they were forced to be, but because they chose to be. It was unprecedented. It was revolutionary. And it scared the hell out of the Kthari leadership. The homeworld was beautiful in a harsh, alien way. Red deserts stretched to the horizon, dotted with purple vegetation that swayed in winds Jake couldn't feel through the ship's viewport. Cities gleamed like jewels, built from materials that seemed to glow with their own inner light. This was a civilization that had conquered dozens of star systems, that had built an empire on military might and absolute control. And Jake, a human mechanic from Earth, was about to tell them their entire military program was based on torture. The trial was held in a massive arena carved from red stone. Thousands of Kthari filled the seats, their eyes fixed on Jake as he stood in the center of the floor. Shadow stood beside him, refusing to be separated even when ordered. Helen had argued for hours to let the beasts stay, finally convincing the council that separating them would prove nothing. The charges were read out in a booming voice that echoed off the stone walls. Interference with military property. Unauthorized modification of Empire assets. Spreading seditious claims against the Science Council. Jake felt his knees go weak. These weren't minor crimes. These were the kind of charges that ended with execution. The head of the Science Council stood to speak, an elderly alien with silver fur and cold eyes. He called Jake a liar and a saboteur. He claimed the implants were perfectly designed for optimal performance, that any problems were due to weak specimens, not flawed technology. He demanded Jake be punished to the fullest extent of Kthari law. Jake's hands were shaking, but he forced himself to speak clearly. He pulled up the data on his scanner, projecting it across the arena for everyone to see. Brain scans showing constant pain signals. Behavioral analyses proving the beasts were more stable without the implants. Chemical readings of stress hormones that were literally killing the creatures from the inside out. He didn't speak like a scientist or a lawyer. He spoke like a mechanic explaining a broken machine to a customer. The implants were badly designed, he said. They caused more problems than they solved. And the proof was standing right next to him. Shadow, who'd been sent to kill him and instead had chosen friendship. Who followed orders better now than before, who was calmer and more focused, who was finally able to be what he was meant to be instead of what pain forced him to be. The arena erupted in arguments. Some Kthari shouted that Jake was right, that they'd lost too many beasts to madness. Others demanded his immediate execution for daring to question their ways. The noise was deafening. Then something unexpected happened. A general stood up from the lower seats, his armor marked with scars from 100 battles. He told the crowd that he'd commanded war beast units for 30 years. He'd lost more beasts to malfunction than to enemy fire. He'd always wondered why creatures bred for war kept going insane. Now he knew. They weren't malfunctioning. They were breaking under torture. More voices joined his. Matriarchs who'd seen beasts destroyed because they couldn't be controlled. Handlers who'd formed bonds with their beasts only to watch them spiral into madness. Scientists who'd questioned the implant designs but been silenced by the council. The head of the Science Council's face grew darker with each testimony. He tried to argue, to deflect, to discredit the speakers. But the evidence was overwhelming. Finally, when a junior scientist presented financial records showing how the council had been profiting from the constant need for new implants and new beasts, the elderly scientist's composure cracked. He announced his resignation right there in front of everyone. But his parting words were chilling. He told Jake that he'd won today, but that he had no idea what he'd unleashed. The war beasts weren't the only project, he said. There were other weapons, other experiments, other plans that Jake couldn't even imagine. Then he walked out of the arena, and within minutes reports came flooding in. Explosions across the capital city. The Science Council's facilities were self-destructing, destroying decades of research and evidence. And worst of all, war beasts across the planet were being activated remotely, their implants forcing them into berserker rages. Helen grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward an exit. They needed to get him somewhere safe, she said. But Jake pulled away. He told her the beasts weren't the enemy. They were victims being forced to attack. If he could jam the control signal, he could free them from the compulsion. Helen stared at him like he'd lost his mind. The entire city was under attack. Buildings were burning. People were dying. And Jake wanted to save the attackers? Jake looked at Shadow, who was watching the chaos with understanding in his eyes. These were Shadow's brothers and sisters out there, being tortured into violence against their will. Jake couldn't save the city by killing them. He had to save them by freeing them. He told Helen he needed to get to the nearest warbeast facility. If there were any implants left intact, he could reverse engineer the control frequency and broadcast a counter signal. It was risky. It might not work. But it was the only chance they had to stop the violence without massacring innocent creatures. Helen made her decision in seconds. She assigned Kate and a squad of warriors to escort Jake. They ran through streets filled with smoke and screaming, dodging rubble and panicking civilians. The warbeast facility was on the northern edge of the city, and by the time they reached it, the place was a disaster. Dead handlers lay scattered around broken cages. Equipment was smashed. And in the middle of it all, one dead warbeast with its implants still partially intact. Jake dove for it, his scanner already out and recording data. His fingers flew over the controls as he decoded the signal. It was complex, layered with encryption and failsafes. But Jake had been fixing complicated systems his whole life. This was just another broken thing that needed fixing. He found the control frequency and started programming a counter signal. His modification would override the pain commands, tell the beasts to stop fighting, to return to their facilities, to ignore the external control. It would free them at least temporarily from whoever was puppeting them. Kate helped him upload the signal to the city's emergency broadcast system. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then reports started coming in over the communicators. War beasts across the city were stopping mid-attack, sitting down, looking confused. The violence was ending. But not everywhere. A group of beasts wasn't responding to the counter signal. Jake's scanner showed them converging on the main spaceport, clearing a path for someone. The elderly scientist was escaping and he was taking something with him. A case that pulsed with blue light, containing what had to be the master control unit for every implant in the Empire. If he got away with that, he could activate every warbeast in Kthari space whenever he wanted. Millions of creatures turned into weapons with the press of a button. Jake stared at his scanner in horror as he tracked the group of controlled warbeasts heading toward the spaceport. There were at least 30 of them, all being forced to fight against their will, all clearing a path for the scientist to escape with the master control device. If that thing left the planet, the entire Kthari Empire would be at risk. Millions of warbeasts could be activated at any moment, turned into killing machines with no way to stop them. Helen was already barking orders into her communicator, trying to coordinate her forces to intercept. But the warbeasts were moving too fast, cutting through defensive positions like they weren't even there. The Kthari soldiers were trained warriors, but they were hesitating. These were their own warbeasts, creatures that had fought beside them for years. Killing them felt wrong even if it was necessary. Jake looked at Shadow, who was watching the distant battle with tension in every muscle. The big beast could sense his packmates being tortured, forced to fight when they didn't want to. Shadow's ears were flat against his head, a low whine building in his throat. He wanted to help them but didn't know how. An idea hit Jake, crazy and dangerous and probably suicidal. But it was the only chance they had. He turned to Kate and told her he needed a way to get to the spaceport fast. She looked at him like he'd grown a second head. The spaceport was in the middle of a war zone. Even if they could get there, what was one human mechanic going to do against 30 war beasts and a desperate scientist? Jake pulled up the schematics of Shadow's remaining cybernetic implants on his scanner. When he'd removed the pain devices, he'd left some of the basic hardware in place, the parts that weren't actively hurting Shadow. Those implants were dormant now, but they could be repurposed. If Jake could modify them to broadcast his counter-signal, amplified by Shadow's own biological systems, they could override the control frequency within a 100-meter radius. The catch was that someone would have to get close enough to the controlled beast for it to work. Really close. Like riding on Shadow's back while charging into battle close. Kate asked if he was completely insane. The answer was probably yes, but Jake didn't have a better plan. He started jury-rigging a broadcast amplifier using parts from his repair kit and Shadow's dormant implants. It wasn't pretty and it definitely wasn't safe. The system would probably burn out after one use, and there was a good chance it would overload Shadow's nervous system in the process. Jake knelt down beside Shadow and explained what he needed to do. He told the war beast that this would hurt, that it was dangerous, that there was a real chance they wouldn't survive. But those other war beasts out there, they were Shadow's family. They deserved the same freedom Shadow had found. They deserved a choice. Shadow looked at Jake with those intelligent amber eyes, and Jake saw the decision being made. The war beast lowered himself to the ground, making it easier for Jake to climb onto his back. It was an invitation and a promise. They'd do this together whatever the cost. Jake had never ridden anything bigger than a horse, and that had been years ago. Shadow was easily 3 times the size of any horse, all muscle and power and barely contained energy. Jake grabbed hold of the cybernetic ridge along Shadow's spine and held on tight. Kate grabbed a combat rifle and climbed onto Storm's back. She wasn't about to let Jake charge into battle alone, even if the whole plan was insane. 3 other Kthari warriors followed her example, mounting the freed war beasts that Jake had operated on. It wasn't much of a cavalry, but it would have to do. Helen gave them covering fire coordinates and wished them luck. The tone of her voice said she didn't expect to see any of them alive again. Shadow launched forward like a missile and Jake almost fell off immediately. He pressed himself flat against the beast's back, his legs gripping tight, his hands tangled in Shadow's fur. The wind whipped his face as they raced through the burning streets. Shadow moved with incredible speed and grace, leaping over rubble, sliding around corners, navigating the chaos like he'd been born to it. The other freed war beasts followed, carrying their Kthari riders. They moved as a pack, coordinated without needing words, understanding each other on some instinctive level that Jake couldn't fully comprehend. This was what war beasts were supposed to be. Not tortured slaves, but proud warriors fighting for something they believed in. They reached the spaceport in minutes, bursting through the outer perimeter where the controlled war beasts were fighting Kthari soldiers. Jake activated the broadcast amplifier, and immediately felt Shadow's body tense beneath him. The signal was working, but it was draining Shadow fast. The war beast's breathing became labored, his movements less fluid. The first controlled war beast they passed suddenly stopped attacking. It shook its head like it was waking from a bad dream, then sat down, free from the compulsion. Then the next one stopped. And the next. Like dominoes falling, the controlled beasts dropped out of combat as Jake and Shadow raced past them. Some of the freed beasts looked confused and scared. Others looked angry at what had been done to them. But all of them stopped fighting the Kthari soldiers and turned to face the real enemy, the scientist who had been controlling them. Jake could see the elderly scientist now, running toward a sleek ship on the main landing pad. He was clutching the glowing case to his chest, shouting into a communicator, probably calling for help that wasn't going to arrive in time. Shadow put on a burst of speed that made Jake's eyes water. They closed the distance in seconds, landing between the scientist and his escape ship. The old Kthari stumbled backward, his face twisting with rage and fear. He shouted at Shadow, ordering the war beast to attack Jake. The command was broadcast through the master control unit at maximum power. But Shadow had no implants left to receive it. The beast just growled, low and threatening, taking a step toward the scientist. The old Kthari fumbled with the control unit, trying to activate the self-destruct, trying to trigger every implant in the city simultaneously. If he couldn't escape, he'd take everyone down with him. Jake slid off Shadow's back, his legs shaky from the ride. He told the scientist to stop, to let it go, that it was over. But the scientist just laughed, a bitter, angry sound. He said Jake had no idea what he'd done. The Warbeast project was just the beginning. There were other experiments, other species compromised, other weapons hidden across the galaxy. He raised the control unit, his finger hovering over the activation button. One press and thousands of warbeasts would go berserk, killing everything in sight until their implants burned out or they died from the strain. Jake dove forward, tackling the scientist before he could press the button. They hit the ground hard, the control unit skittering across the landing pad. Shadow leaped over them, snatching the device in his jaws before anyone else could reach it. Kthari soldiers surrounded them, weapons raised. The scientist was subdued, restrained, dragged away, still screaming about how they'd all regret this, how the architects wouldn't allow this interference, how Jake had signed his own death warrant. Jake picked himself up, bruised and shaking. Shadow brought him the control unit, surprisingly gentle despite the powerful jaws that could have crushed the device easily. Jake took it, his hands trembling as he examined the technology that had caused so much suffering. Helen arrived with reinforcements, surveying the scene with a mix of relief and disbelief. She told Jake that his crazy plan had actually worked. The controlled warbeasts were free, the scientist was captured, and the control unit was secure. It was over. Except it wasn't over. Not really. Jake looked at the control unit, at the data it contained. The scientist had told the truth about one thing. This was bigger than just the Kthari. According to the device's memory banks, there were similar programs in dozens of other civilizations. The Zenth Collective, whoever they were, had been infiltrating societies across the galaxy for decades, maybe centuries. Over the next few weeks, Jake worked with Kthari technicians to extract as much data as possible from the control unit. What they found was terrifying. The Zenth had planted biological weapons, control devices, and genetic modifications in species across multiple star systems. They'd corrupted military programs, scientific research, even medical treatments. All designed to destabilize civilizations from within, to create chaos that the Zenth could exploit. The Kthari Council formally apologized to Jake and dismissed all charges against him. They offered him citizenship, rank, and resources. They gave him a ship called the Liberator, fast and well-armed, designed for long-range missions. His job, if he chose to accept it, was to track down and neutralize the other Zenth weapons across the galaxy. Jake stood in the ship's observation deck, looking out at the stars. Shadow was beside him, fully recovered from their desperate ride into battle. The other freed warbeasts were scattered throughout the ship, no longer in cages but in proper quarters, treated as crew members rather than weapons. Kate found him there, her arm still in a sling from the battle. She told him the crew was ready whenever he was. They had coordinates for 3 potential Zenth operations: mining colonies infected with some kind of plague, soldiers in the human fleet showing signs of behavioral modification, and warrior mutations in a species called the Drachner. Jake asked Kate why she was coming with him. She was a decorated warrior who could have any posting she wanted. Why sign up for what was basically a galaxy-wide cleanup mission? Kate smiled and told him that he'd taught her something important. That strength wasn't about how much damage you could do, but about how much good you could create. That the most powerful warriors were the ones who chose to protect instead of destroy. She wanted to learn how to be that kind of warrior, and Jake was the best teacher she could find. The Liberator launched from Kthari space, heading toward the first target system. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. There were thousands, maybe millions of beings out there suffering like Shadow had suffered. Enslaved by technology they didn't understand, tortured for purposes they hadn't chosen, treated as tools instead of individuals. But Jake had freed Shadow and 15 other warbeasts. He'd exposed a conspiracy that threatened entire civilizations. He'd proven that compassion was stronger than control, that respect was more effective than fear, that one person who cared enough could make a real difference. Shadow pressed against his side, and Jake ran his hand through the beast's soft fur. Whatever came next, whatever dangers they faced, whatever impossible odds they encountered, Jake wouldn't face them alone. He had Shadow, he had the freed warbeast, he had Kate and a crew who believed in what they were doing. Together, they were going to save people. Lots of people. Even if it took years. Even if it was dangerous. Even if nobody else thought it was possible. Because that's what Jake did. He fixed broken things. And right now the galaxy was very, very broken. But it wouldn't stay that way forever. The Liberator cut through space at maximum speed, heading toward the Korvax mining colonies where reports of a mysterious plague had been spreading for weeks. Jake sat in the medical bay, studying the data they'd received. 15,000 workers infected with something that made them violent and confused, with crystalline growths appearing under their skin. It had all the hallmarks of Zenth bioweapons, just like the Warbeast implants. Shadow lay beside his chair, watching Jake work with those patient amber eyes. The Warbeast had barely left Jake's side since they departed Kthari space. It was like Shadow knew they were heading into danger and wasn't about to let his human face it alone. The Korvax were an insect-like species that specialized in deep space mining. They dug into asteroids and dead planets across 3 sectors, pulling out rare minerals that dozens of civilizations needed. If the Zenth could disrupt the Korvax operations, they'd cripple supply chains across half the galaxy. It was a smart target, which made it even more terrifying. When they arrived at Colony 7, the main infection site, Jake was shocked by what he found. The mining facility had been turned into a makeshift hospital, with infected Korvax restrained in medical pods. They thrashed against their restraints, their mandibles clicking in distress, their compound eyes unfocused and wild. The crystalline growths pulsed with a faint blue light under their shells, spreading slowly through their bodies like cancer. Jake spent hours examining the infected workers, running scans, taking samples. The crystals were growing by hijacking the host's cellular structure, converting organic tissue into a biomechanical hybrid. It was elegant and horrible at the same time. The Zenth had turned the Korvax's own bodies into weapons against them. The local medical director, a Korvax scientist named Dr. Chin, was desperate for answers. She tried everything conventional medicine could offer, but nothing worked. The infection just kept spreading and more workers got sick every day. At the rate things were going, the entire colony would be compromised within a month. Jake worked through the night, Shadow keeping him company while he synthesized and tested different compounds. The Warbeast seemed to understand that this was important, that Jake needed to focus. Shadow would occasionally nudge Jake's hand when he'd been staring at the same data for too long, forcing him to take breaks and eat something. After 12 hours of non-stop work, Jake found the answer. The crystals needed specific proteins to replicate, proteins they stole from the host's body. If he could create an enzyme that broke down those proteins faster than the crystals could absorb them, the growths would dissolve on their own. He tested it on tissue samples first. The crystals began to break apart within minutes, crumbling into harmless dust that the body could flush out naturally. Jake's hands were shaking as he prepared the first dose for a living patient. If this worked, he could save 15,000 lives. If it failed, he might kill someone with his experimental treatment. Dr. Chen and Kate watched tensely as Jake injected the first patient. 4-5 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then the blue glow in the crystals began to fade. The Korvax workers' vital signs stabilized. The thrashing stopped. The patient's eyes focused, really focused for the first time in weeks. It worked. Jake spent the next 3 days treating infected workers around the clock. He worked until he literally collapsed from exhaustion, was dragged to a bed by Kate, slept for 4 hours, then got up and went right back to work. Shadow and the other freed Warbeasts helped in unexpected ways. They could sense which patients were most critical, could calm panicking workers with their presence, could somehow communicate reassurance without words. The Korvax workers were amazed by the Warbeast. They'd heard stories about the vicious killing machines of the Kthari Empire, but these creatures were gentle and protective. Shadow would sit with recovering patients, his massive body warm and solid, his presence comforting. It was like the Warbeast understood what it felt like to be trapped in your own body, to be in pain with no way to make it stop. By the end of the 3rd day, every infected worker had been cured. The Korvax Council sent a formal message of gratitude, along with detailed records of everything they'd learned about the crystals. They also sent a warning. The Zenth had tried to destroy the Korvax mining operations, which meant they were planning something big. Something that required disrupting supply chains across multiple sectors. Jake barely had time to catch his breath before they were racing toward the next crisis. The Terran Defense Fleet, humanity's own military, had reports of behavioral changes in soldiers who'd received neural enhancement implants. The symptoms matched Zenth interference, which meant Jake's own species had been compromised. The journey to Earth's moon, where the fleet headquarters was located, took 2 weeks. Jake used that time to train Kate and some of the crew in the implant removal procedures he developed. If they were going to save 200,000 modified soldiers, Jake couldn't do it alone. He needed a team. Shadow spent those weeks bonding with the crew. The Warbeast would patrol the ship, checking on everyone, making sure they were okay. The crew started calling him the ship's guardian, and Jake couldn't help but smile every time he heard it. Shadow had gone from being a weapon sent to kill him to being a protector who looked after everyone. When they reached Earth, Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. He hadn't been home in years, hadn't seen the blue marble of his home planet since he'd left to work on Frontier Station. Earth looked beautiful from orbit, but Jake knew that beauty was hiding a serious problem. 200,000 soldiers with Zenth implants in their heads, waiting to be activated like sleeper agents. The Terran military was skeptical at first. Admiral Thompson, who commanded the defense fleet, didn't want to believe that their revolutionary neural enhancement program had been compromised. But when Jake showed her the evidence, the connections to the same shell companies that had funded the Kthari Warbeast program, her skepticism turned to cold fury. They set up massive treatment centers across the fleet. Jake taught human doctors his removal techniques, modified for human neurology. The procedures went faster than with the Korvax because Jake had refined his methods. They were clearing 5,000 soldiers a day working around the clock. But they weren't fast enough. On day 13, Terran intelligence intercepted a Zenth transmission. It was a test signal, checking if the implants were still active and responsive. The Zenth knew what Jake was doing and they weren't happy about it. Jake realized they needed to jam the Zenth signal entirely, create an interference field that would block any activation commands. The problem was that the field would need to cover the entire solar system. No single ship had that kind of range. Unless they used every ship in the system working together. Jake proposed turning every Terran vessel, every station, every transmission array into a synchronized jamming network. It was insane. It would require perfect coordination across thousands of platforms. One mistake and the whole thing would collapse. Admiral Thompson listened to his plan, looked at the data, and made the call. They do it. Operation Sanctuary was a go. The next 72 hours were a nightmare of precise timing and desperate hope. Every ship in the Sol system aligned itself according to Jake's calculations. The Liberator coordinated the entire network, with Shadow and the other Warbeasts somehow helping to stabilize the signal. Their dormant implants, though no longer causing pain, could still detect Zenth frequencies and helped filter out interference. The jamming field held barely. Jake and his teams worked non-stop, removing implants from soldiers as fast as humanly possible. They were racing against time, knowing that the field could collapse at any moment. At hour 68, the field started to destabilize. The synchronized arrays were drifting out of alignment faster than they could correct. Jake did the math and realized they weren't going to make it. 15,000 soldiers still had active implants, and they only had 2 hours before the jamming field failed completely. That's when Shadow did something incredible. The Warbeast walked to the communication console and placed his paw on it, looking back at Jake with clear intention. Shadow wanted to help stabilize the field by using his own dormant implants as a signal booster. Jake's heart sank. He knew what that would mean. The power requirements would be enormous. It could kill Shadow and the other Warbeast. But before Jake could refuse, Storm, Razor, Ghost, and Thunder joined Shadow at the console. All 5 Warbeasts were volunteering to risk their lives to save the human soldiers. Kate connected them to the network. The Warbeasts shuddered as power flowed through their bodies, but the jamming field stabilized instantly. They were buying Jake the time he needed. The medical teams went into overdrive. Doctors who'd been working for days found new energy, knowing that the Warbeasts were sacrificing themselves to give humanity this chance. Soldiers waiting for treatment cheered on those ahead of them, creating a wave of determination that pushed everyone to move faster. Jake removed the last implant with 4 minutes to spare. Every soldier was clear. Every human in the defense fleet was free from Zenth control. They disconnected the Warbeasts immediately and all 5 collapsed. Shadow's vital signs were critical, his breathing barely perceptible. Jake was at his side in seconds, his hands moving on autopilot as he worked to stabilize the Warbeast who'd saved his life more times than he could count. For a terrifying moment, Jake thought he'd lost Shadow. The Warbeast's heart stopped, and Jake performed emergency resuscitation, shocking Shadow's system back to life. The heart started again, weak but beating. Shadow's recovery took 3 weeks. Jake refused to leave his side, sleeping on the floor next to the medical bed, holding Shadow's paw through the worst of it. The bond between them had grown beyond friendship into something deeper. They were family now, brothers who'd faced death together and come out the other side. When Shadow finally woke up, looking at Jake with those amber eyes that held so much trust and affection, Jake couldn't stop the tears. He told Shadow he was never allowed to scare him like that again, that next time they needed to save the galaxy, they'd find a way that didn't almost kill everyone Jake cared about. Shadow rumbled, a sound that might have been agreement or might have been laughter. It was hard to tell. The Terran government honored the crew of the Liberator with the highest civilian medals humanity could offer. Admiral Thompson personally thanked Jake, telling him that he'd saved not just the defense fleet but potentially the entire human species. But there was no time to rest. Intelligence from both the Kthari and the Terrans confirmed what the captured scientist had said. There were more Zenth operations, more compromised species, more weapons waiting to be activated. An organization called the Architects was coordinating it all, trying to reshape the galaxy according to their vision of controlled evolution. Jake stood on the observation deck of the Liberator, looking at Earth one last time before they departed for the next mission. Shadow pressed against his side, fully recovered and ready for whatever came next. Kate joined them, carrying orders from a newly formed coalition. The Kthari, the Terrans, the Korvax, and a dozen other species had banded together to fight the Zenth threat. And they all wanted Jake to lead the effort.